Somebody, if he can go get me some water, please. I'm not that run out.
Sex. My attitude toward what? Sex. Say it again. Sex.
Welcome to episode 22 of a podcast called My Weird Record Collection. I'm Sean, and I'm coming to you proudly from the city of Chicago. And I hereby invite you, my friends, into my odd world of strange, miscellaneous, and otherwise uncategorizable media for your turntable. Why proudly from Chicago? I think the question you should be asking is, why didn't you say proudly before? And I have a perfectly logical, sane explanation for that. That explanation is, I don't know. Anyway, my friends, in this episode, we're going to be exploring a 12-inch long player called Educate Your Dog by the Eisenmann Method, graced upon us by Charles Paul Eisenmann. Before we do that, though, I'm going to give you what very well might be the last update of my saga in trying to get the Makaha sessions. Those of you who don't know the story, I will be as quick as possible to get you up to speed. April 2025, Record Store Day. There was an album out for Record Store Day called The Makaha Sessions. Problem: not many were pressed. None of the stores in my area had a copy. Good news, though, a friend of mine in a neighboring state happened to see it at his record store, so he picked up a copy for me, sent it to me. Problem: literally as the carrier was walking it over to my home, the carrier decided, this is not deliverable because I do not see the name of the recipient on the mailbox. Problem with that, of course, is that my name has always been on my mailbox. As per the day that I am recording this, I have been living at this place for 19 years and 8 days, and my name has been on the mailbox since day one. Also, it is a 12-inch record and a 13 by 13-inch cover, and will not fit in the mailbox. And as with any other large package, it won't fit in the mailbox. It wouldn't even go in the mailbox anyway. It would go on the floor of the foyer. Also, I heard from another carrier who said, yeah, we really don't care what the name is. As long as we have an address, it goes. Also, to contradict our carrier's assertion that it was because our name wasn't on the box, literally today we got a delivery for a tenant who no longer lives in the building and whose name is not on the box. So yeah, tell me another one. Actually, don't tell me another one. Meanwhile, as the package was returned to my friend who was the sender, it got lost somewhere at the hub in his metropolitan area, where it has remained since May of 2025. So I reached out to the post office. They told me the sender has to be the one to reach out. That would be my friend in the adjacent state. So my friend reached out to the post office. They said, you have to wait 45 days at least. So my friend reached out after 45 days, and the post office got back in touch with him and said, sorry, you're past the deadline to file a claim. Problem: on the post office website, it says you have anywhere from 45 days to a whole year to file a claim. It had only been a few months, not an entire year. So my friend filed an appeal as per the instructions on the letter he got that said, sorry, denied. Well, he just heard back regarding the appeal, and once again, they denied it. They said, sorry, we still find you not following the proper process. We told you when the deadline was. You've exceeded that deadline. No, he did not. Nonetheless, he said, I'm sorry, man, but this is as far as I'm going. And I don't blame him. I don't blame him. So that is what happened with that. That is the United States Post Office at work. So yeah, that's been my adventures with the Makaha sessions. And mentioned last episode, I do have a copy. I found another copy through, I think Discogs.com got one for actually half of what record stores were asking for it. And at least I have something to listen to. But still, man, still, come on. But we'll get that all over with, shall we? Also, I just wanted to address a couple of comments that I received about the last episode, episode 21, regarding Glenn W. Turner and his record, Dare to Be Great. Longtime listener David says, and I quote, "I live a mere 2 miles away from the dock," meaning the dock of where Glenn Turner had his castle, which I said you could visit at 4082 Scarlet Iris. But he says, "I live a mere 2 miles away from the dock, so I checked it out on my walk this morning. There was something about Glenn Turner that reminds me of Elizabeth Holmes. Deep down inside, I'd like to think they both believed in what they were preaching, but got lost along the way. Although the scale of Holmes' misadventures cost a bit more." I actually I had to look up Elizabeth Holmes. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I wasn't sure. And I looked up the name on Wikipedia, and yeah, I remember where I heard that name before. She was might still be a businesswoman who a few years ago got in some major, major trouble. I'm not going to get into this story because, number one, I didn't really look all that far into it. And number two, I'm pretty sure I'd screw something up. But yeah, thanks for your thoughts on that, David. And thank you for checking out the former site of the castle and the current site of the, was it the lake house or something? That I don't remember what I said. It was my own friggin' podcast. I also heard from longtime listener, and that this podcast is only about 1.5 years old. But Chris, who noticed that there was a soundbite of Glenn Turner talking about LSD.
"My secret of success is I'm a user of LSD, the real drug. A drug that can really turn you on."
He said, is that really what he said, or did you manipulate the audio? I do not manipulate if I do manipulate the audio, I say so. Kind of like I did with Earl Nightingale's record, A Great Way to Live, A Tragic Way to Die. How I took some audio samples and basically remade the Anison commercial from the 60s with it. That I manipulated, and I fessed up to that in the episode. What I did not fess up to with Glenn W. Turner was, of course, the LSD quote was taken very out of context. Here's what he actually said in the proper context.
"And the secret of Dare to Be Great and my secret of success is I'm a user of LSD, the real drug. A drug that can really turn you on. You'll never have any depressed moments. You'll never have any bad feelings. It's called love, service, and dedication."
So, Chris, thank you for asking. I'm sure others were wondering the same thing and probably concluded that, yeah, this must have been out of context. But now that I've talked about all that, let's dive into Educate Your Dog by the Eisenmann method. But before we do, let's learn about who this Eisenmann person is or was, as the case may be. Even though he's credited as Charles on the album, he actually introduces himself as Chuck Eisenmann, and that's actually probably how he was better known as.
"My name is Chuck Eisenmann."
He was born on October 22nd, 1918 in Hawthorne, Wisconsin, and was one of 9 children of his German immigrant parents, Richard and Marie. He grew up in Parkland, which is about 15 miles northwest of Hawthorne, and he graduated from high school sometime in 1937. During the time I had to research this, I wasn't able to determine exactly where he graduated from high school, but whatever the case, immediately after he did so, he joined the Army and played baseball for the 8th Field Artillery in Honolulu, where he was named to all Hawaiian baseball and track teams. Eisenmann's natural athletic abilities, particularly his pitching skills, caught the attention of a scout from the Detroit Tigers, who actually bought him out of the Army. For the next couple of years, Chuck played for various teams in the minor leagues until the San Diego Padres, before they were a major league team, purchased his contract in November of 1941. He only played for the Padres until April of 42, though, and at that point he rejoined the Army and very quickly put together the Signal Monarchs baseball team in London, and that team in 1943 would become part of the London International Baseball League, which consisted of baseball teams from American and Canadian military teams and a civilian team from England. With Eisenmann pitching, the Monarchs won 14 out of 16 games, pretty impressive. 13 of those victories were consecutive. Ultimately, he led the team to winning the league's championship. After that, he formed an all-star U.S. military baseball team to represent the Army's Central Base Station, or CBS, as they called it over in London, and that team was now the CBS Clowns. Chuck was pretty busy with the Clowns until July 1944, when a buzz bomb flew into his office and exploded, nearly blowing off his index finger and landing him in the hospital for a week. He claimed that he turned down the Purple Heart medal, saying, and I quote, "I figured I wasn't damaged enough." He eventually returned to the CBS Clowns and, as therapy for his damaged finger, developed an overhand curveball pitch that proved to be virtually unhittable. Eisenmann's days in London came to an end as his unit followed the Allied forces through Europe and settled in Paris, where he and the now renamed Seine, S-E-I-N-E, section Clowns brought baseball to the liberated people of France, and that resulted in the first ever baseball game on French soil, and that was played on October 2nd, 1944, in Paris, in front of a crowd of 6,000 people. During his time in Paris, Chuck also presented exhibition games of football, volleyball, basketball, and possibly a few other American sports, just to give the French some exposure to American sports. After taking charge of all the Army's athletic activities in 1945 and being promoted to major, Eisenmann came back to the States at the end of the year and almost immediately rejoined the San Diego Padres in the newly christened AAA Pacific Coast League. But after only half a mediocre season, he was bumped over to the Tulsa Oilers in the Class AA Texas League. He attributed his rocky start to having played for several years on all military teams, and ergo he wasn't up against professional baseball players, really. After another mediocre half season, he went back to the Padres, who, after several games of dismal performances from Eisenmann, sold him to the Memphis Chicks of the Class AA Southern Association, where his game significantly improved. Let's jump over to September of 1948. Chuck was called up to the Memphis Chicks' Major League parent club, the Chicago White Sox. However, he spent a year on the bench with the Sox and then returned to the Memphis Chicks with the option to be recalled by the Sox, which did happen in September of 1949, despite him having a losing season with the Memphis Chicks. However, a month later, he found himself traded to the Brooklyn Dodgers, but Chuck saw the writing on the wall. He knew that the Dodgers had enough pitchers in their rotation that his chances of actually playing were slim to most likely none, and so ended his career in the major leagues. Until 1955, Eisenmann played for various professional and semi-professional teams. Then he went to the Bill McGowan School for Umpires in Daytona Beach the next year, and upon graduating, he became an umpire in the California League. After a year of umpiring, Chuck started pitching again, this time for the Bismarck Barons of the semi-professional MAN-DAK, that's MAN-DAK, League. At this point, I remind you, the record that this podcast episode is talking about is called Educate Your Dog by the Eisenmann Method. So, why am I talking about baseball? Did I get the wrong Chuck Eisenmann? No, my friends, no. Yeah, he was all about baseball, but during his brief tenure with the Bismarck Barons, what was most memorable about Chuck wasn't his pitching, but his German Shepherd named London. He named the dog after where he spent a great deal of time in the Army. According to an article in the Bismarck Tribune dated August 17th, 1956, London, and I quote, brought keys to Eisenmann's car, bowed to the crowd, brought a bat and a broom to the pitcher, ran the bases, brought a ball bag from the mound, told how old he is, 5 that is, imitated a kangaroo, closed a door, turned out a light, played dead, untied a boy, and did a little typewriting. On another occasion, Chuck got into a dispute with an umpire, prompting London to jump up and shove the umpire, and as a result, Chuck Eisenmann was ejected from that game. And that incident actually worked out quite well for Chuck and London because Life magazine wrote an article about the incident and featured it in the July 25th, 1955 issue. London the dog's presence was so important to Eisenmann that rather than fly with his teams, Eisenmann would drive to away games with London making the trips with him. There are conflicting stories as to when Chuck got London. Could have been 1947 when he owned a nightclub in Los Angeles. That is, Chuck owning the nightclub, not London, as it were, of course. It could have been 1953. Whatever the case, Eisenmann bought London to be a watchdog, but ended up actually training him. And with that training came an acting career. Yes, that's right. London the dog became an actor, and he was featured on the human interest TV show called You Asked For It. In 1957, a delivery truck crashed into the car that Chuck and London were in, and as a result, London was injured. He had a couple of bumps on the head. I think he suffered a broken leg too. So in 1961, Chuck filed a lawsuit against the company that owned the truck, seeking $35,000 in damages, claiming that London's injuries in the accident limited his acting gigs. But the jury found in the favor of the defense. When the verdict was read at the trial, London reportedly growled in response. But even after that accident, London still had a pretty prolific career, which might be why Eisenmann lost the case. Among London's filmography are The Littlest Hobo and the Canadian TV show that movie spawned, My Dog Buddy, Just Between Us, and Marks of Distinction. London had a lot of offspring. He is said to have fathered 286 dogs, good Lord, many of whom also appeared in films and occasionally stood in for London. Both during and after London's life, Chuck had many German shepherds, some of whom were named London. In fact, at one point, he reportedly had as many as 6 dogs at the same time, all named London. Now, I couldn't find any definitive details about Chuck's personal life, but he did have at least one child, but I could find no reference to a spouse or any named domestic partners. According to people who knew him, he never smoked, he never drank, but later in life he developed dementia. Despite the dementia, he never forgot his loved ones, both humans and dogs. Also later in life, he moved to Roseburg, Oregon, where he died on September 6, 2010, at the age of 91. By the way, in addition to his career as a dog trainer and a baseball pitcher, Chuck also spent time as a sports writer for the Kearney Hub in Nebraska in the late 50s. Chuck wrote 4 books on dog training, and he recorded at least one long-playing record about dog training. So let's talk about that record right now. First, I'll talk about the physical record itself, and I'll be as descriptive as I can because, after all, this is an audio podcast, so if you're not watching the YouTube video, you're going to have to get an idea for what this thing looks like. But the front cover, it's a picture of Chuck Eisenmann. He's wearing a pink button-down shirt and kind of bluish-greenish pants, and he's in basically athletic take-a-knee position, and he is surrounded by 5 German shepherds. And in the background, it looks like he's basically in the middle of nowhere, like a big country area. You see what looks like it might be a gravel road behind him, and he's in a very grassy field, and behind him are trees. At the top, you have the title of the album in big yellow serifed letters. It says, "Educate Your Dog," and then below that, in smaller letters, slightly smaller letters, in black in the same font, it says, "By the Eisenmann Method." This is all capital letters, by the way. And in the very top right corner, it has the logo for Sight and Sound Enterprise Incorporated. And beneath the logo, it says Sight and Sound Inc. And the Sight and Sound logo, it's 2 capital serifed S's. And in between those 2 S's, there's a box with a 16th note in the box, but instead of a dot at the base of the note, it's a drawing of an eye with the pupil and iris and everything. Kind of weird. But yeah, this record is on the Sight and Sound Enterprise Inc. label, and I have not been able to find out a thing about that label. This is the only record I could associate with this particular record label. It might very well be the only one that exists on it, and it might just be, for all I know, an in-house homebrew record label by Chuck Eisenmann himself. And as I flip the cover and look at the back, I see there's some very faint pencil writing in it that says something B, I can't make it all out, something B 2021. And then next to it, it says $2. Now, I bought this record on January 6th, 2024. And when I did, I paid $12.50. This was at Valhalla in Oak Park, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. I think I got a pretty good deal on it because the lowest price it ever sold for on Discogs.com was $15, and the highest was $36. And on eBay, the one copy I saw is currently listed at $19.95, I think. But yeah, $2. Oh man, if I only got this thing sooner. But while I'm on the back cover, on the top third, I would say, of the back cover, there is a picture of Chuck Eisenmann with two of his dogs, and it's airbrushed with a white background. They're at a table with all kinds of papers, and there's a microphone on a, oh man, what do you call those little microphone holder things, those little boom things? I have two of those things, and I don't know what they're friggin' called, but you know, you see them at radio stations and all this, because we've all been to a radio station, right? But he's sitting behind the microphone with all these papers on the table and a pair of headphones off to his right. And underneath that is the track listing. And the track listing, side 1, track 1 is Preface, and side 2, track 12. Here, they don't reset the numbering for side 2. So side 1 ends with track 5, side 2 begins with track 6, but track 12 is called Summary. And I will tell you about the other tracks in between in just a moment. But on the bottom half of the back cover, in a Clarendon font face, it has a blurb about Chuck Eisenmann. There's nobody credited to writing it. It just says, Charles B. Eisenmann, world-renowned dog educator who, through his frequent personal appearances on Mike Douglas, Johnny Carson, and Merv Griffin shows, to name a few, has become known to millions of TV viewers as Chuck. And it goes on to talk about his dogs, or his boys, named London, Hobo, Thorn, Lance, and Toro. And let's see, what else do we have here? Bought his first dog in 1946, blah, 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 blah. His first dog, London the First, featured in 2 full-length motion pictures. But I did find it interesting that the blurb has a quote from Chuck here. It says, "Man has locked the dog into a mental kindergarten by assuming he's nothing more than a furry robot activated solely by reward and punishment conditioned reflexes. With my method, I have defined and disproven the time-worn dogmas of animal psychology by breaking my dogs out of that confusing kindergarten." Now, underneath the blurb in small print, it says produced by Jerry Johnson for Sight and Sound Enterprises, Inc., audio engineer Bill Essel, E-S-E-L-L, and on the bottom left it says copyright 1975, printed in USA. So yeah, I guess maybe this isn't a homebrew. Well, it could be a homebrew label, I guess, by Chuck Eisenmann if he hired that producer and engineer himself, but I don't know. And I mentioned before how I'm going to pay a little bit more attention to the spines on these record covers, and once again, there's no writing on the spine here. So if you store your records spine out, like say on a bookcase or an IKEA Kallax unit or something like that, you have to know what the cover looks like in order to identify the spine. Now, the record is a little bit on the thin side, but not overly thin, like say the Dare to Be Great record I talked about in the previous episode. Doesn't need to be very thick, doesn't need to be the best vinyl in the world. It's a spoken word recording. It is a mono recording, plays back at 33 1/3, which you are told nowhere in this record anywhere, be it on the cover or on the record label. The record label, by the way, is kind of an off-white, and it has the same font as the front cover. It says, "Educate Your Dog" by the Eisenmann Method above the spindle hole And below the spindle hole, it has the side indicator like side I and side II. And once again, the track numbering does not start over on side 2. The bottom of the label has the Sight and Sound Enterprises Inc. logo. And I mentioned in at least one previous episode that you can learn something about how or when or where a record was made by looking at the runout area, that blank space at the end of the record but before the label, because usually there's some kind of identifying marker on there, like an etched abbreviation for where the record was pressed, or maybe a serial number or the matrix number. There's no such thing. On side 1 in the runout, there's an etching that says Dog A, and on side 2, there's an etching that says Dog B. So I have no idea where this record was made. This was one of the more difficult ones to make any kind of story about. As for the actual content of the record, well, there's not much to it, really. It's just Chuck Eisenmann talking about his philosophies and habits of educating your dog. There's a preface, and in that preface, he talks about how there are 5 fundamental sounds that your dog has to be familiar with. Chuck, what are those 5 fundamental sounds?
1, stand up. 2, come here. 3, stay there. 4, pick it up. And 5, hold it.
Thank you, Chuck. And then he introduces what he calls 10 mandatory rules that dog owners must learn, live by, and practice in order to make his method work. And each of those 10 mandatory rules happens to correspond to the tracks on the record between the preface and the summary. So on side 1, track 2, you have, and this is the actual name of the track, learn to observe your dog as he observes you. Never overlook a single glance or movement. All that I read you, 2 sentences, is the name of the track. I probably can't fit that in the YouTube title field.
The 4th statement, a wagging tail indicates friendliness. Now, this is not necessarily true. A wagging tail denotes only that there is a relationship between the dog's mind and his physical makeup. It does not tell you what is on his mind at that particular moment. A wagging tail could denote happiness, but the rapid reflexes of a dog could cause him to bite before the tail was even notified.
The next track, number 3, always be positive when judging the reasons for your dog's actions. And that is interesting, though, because Chuck does spend a great deal of time throughout the record explaining that a dog does what the dog does for a reason, including if the dog bites someone. A dog isn't just going to bite someone to bite someone. There was some kind of a threat detected, and there was a reason for that threat that might not be apparent to you and me. It's simply because the dog cannot talk and tell you what that threat is. Next track, learn how to use mental instead of physical approaches to both training and punishing your dog. And one thing that he did talk about in that track that does kind of jibe with most trainers, including the obedience class Lisa and I took our dog Lola to, is when you do reward the dog immediately so the dog knows that what the dog just did is a good thing. Track number 5, gain control of your dog by using the mental instead of the physical leash. Now, here's something that I have a little bit of a problem. I mean, I totally agree about having this mental leash, and what he means by that is being able to get your dog so well behaved that the dog will actually know when it's okay to say walk away when not on the leash, where the physical leash would theoretically not be necessary. I agree with his philosophy there, but the thing is, he seems to indicate that the only reason that you have a physical leash is because of leash laws. And I totally disagree with that because, well, I really hate to be opinionated here, but logic tells me that a dog is going to do what a dog is going to do when the dog wants to do it. Your dog could be behaving perfectly for, say, years, for like 8-9 years, but in year 10, while the dog is sitting there unleashed in your yard, the dog might see something that he or she never saw before, might find very fascinating, and will get up and run to check it out. Or the dog might feel some sense of threat or something. So you never know. Always keep your dog on a leash. And for what it's worth, there is an interesting story he tells that I could probably tell in a quicker amount of time than he does, so I'll tell it right now. One day when he went out and he took his dogs out of the car, a woman with a Dalmatian came running over to him, yelling at him to put the dogs on a leash. Meanwhile, the Dalmatian was dragging her along out of her control to the point that she fell and got scuffed up and scratched and cut up. Meanwhile, his dogs were just sitting there normally. He was about to turn around and tell them, stay sitting where you are, and they already were. So I don't know, but really just keep your dog leashed, okay? For your safety, for everybody else's safety, and especially for the dog's safety. That was side 1. And side 2 begins with track 6, which is called Never Ask Your Dog to Perform a Task Which He Mentally Understands But Physically Cannot Accomplish. That would sound like common sense, wouldn't it? I don't know. But next track, Learn to Compliment and Reward Properly. And then the next track, which is the next rule, of course, do not use single word commands. They limit a dog's potential. What does that mean? I've listened to this record multiple times and I still don't understand his logic. Maybe you will.
I found that by throwing as many words as possible at a dog, while believing he has the capacity to retain some of them and build a vocabulary, pays huge dividends. The dog who only hears one-word commands will never think.
And he actually demonstrates that when he talks to one of his dogs who happened to wander into the recording studio.
Always remember there may be reasons for a dog's actions which do not appear on the surface. I dropped that paper, Hobo. Would you pick it up and give it to me, please? Thank you. Watch so you don't slip. You'll slide on this cover here.
But to this day, you go to any dog trainer, the dog trainer is going to use simple one-word commands like sit, stay, down, off. Next on the record, we have learn the danger of a dog's physical and mental reflexes. And that's where, again, the biting comes from. Basically, he tells you that a dog will not do any particular action without a good reason to do it, whether you like it or not. And let's see, next, use the 5 fundamental sounds in conjunction with the things your dog has been trained to do. And the final rule that you must follow as a dog owner, make common sense your final guide. I gotta say, when listening to this record, it doesn't really sound very, very instructional, but more philosophical than anything. He doesn't really give any detailed how-tos on many of his 10 rules or the 5 sounds that the dog must learn. He just kind of waxes philosophical and tells his own stories. I'm thinking that maybe he would also have wanted you to buy one of his books. And in fact, in January 1976, shortly after this record was recorded and I am assuming released, Chuck published a book called The Better Dog, The Educated Dog. And there's really not much more I could say about the contents of the record other than that's all it is, just Chuck sitting there talking. And at the end of the summary, he talks about how you should listen to the... Well, actually, I'll let Chuck tell you how you should use this record.
And now that you've listened to the album once, listen to it again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again.
Now, there are a couple of things about Chuck's record here that I do want to mention that kind of stuck out to me. One that I didn't really like, the other I did like. First, the thing that I did not like. Chuck seemed to suggest that if your dog gets into something that he or she should not get into, offer some kind of a distraction.
As an example, I have bear rugs on the floors in my home. I saw my youngest dog walk over and sniff the bear's nose. I called London, come here, look at this. And I pulled out my handkerchief and he was momentarily distracted. Several minutes later, it was the claws of the bear, and then a piece of black tape on the electric cord. Each time I called and gave him something else to look at and wonder at. It was my job, and it now becomes yours to observe your dog. When his mind is on something which you consider destructive, switch his thoughts by giving him something else to think about, and he'll forget his original intent.
He has never met my dog. The way my dog operates is if she's getting into something she shouldn't be getting into, she kind of cues what normally would be a distraction to another dog. Instead, she's going to finish doing what she already was doing and then move on to the thing that you offer her, especially if it's food. If she's trying to eat something she shouldn't be eating, if she sees that I'm trying to give her something else, she will hurry up and scarf down the thing she shouldn't be eating just so she can hurry up and get to the thing that she can be eating. And the thing that I did like that really stuck out to me is basically I never bought into that whole dogs can't see in color thing. Because how would we know? How would we know? We have no real way of knowing definitively. And in fact, a 1987 article by Cecil Adams in The Straight Dope, I'll post a link in the show notes, kind of addresses that as well. Now, Chuck Eisenmann also addresses that and seems to imply, if not explicitly state, that dogs actually can see in color, because listen to what he has to say about his dogs and color.
I teach my dog that a certain object is blue. What he sees it as is immaterial to me as long as when I say, get me something which is blue, he can get it.
But having said all that, let's talk about Sean's record collecting thoughts. For this episode of Sean's collecting thoughts, I guess, I'm not going to offer so much as tips or whatever. This is going to be more of a story than anything. This episode is released, obviously, in September of 2025, and just a few days shy of my 26th wedding anniversary. And the story goes back to the 2 or 3 weeks leading up to my wedding. Now, usually, I have something scripted out, either bullet points or actually word for word what I want to say. This time, though, it's just completely off the cuff. There's no script to this, so it might sound a little bit different in terms of vibe, in terms of timbre, if you will. But let's go back to August of 1999. Beatle Fest at the Hyatt Regency O'Hare outside of Chicago. This was my 4th Beatle Fest. This was my, well, soon-to-be wife's 2nd Beatle Fest. And something you would see a lot of at Beatle Fest back in those days was a lot of vendors. There was a huge hall full of them, from craft vendors to souvenir vendors to record sellers. And many of the record sellers would have an album that contained a certain special black triangle. What is this black triangle? It is something that I never learned to look for until Beatlefest 99. It is a special black triangle that can be seen on certain versions of the cover of the Beatles album Yesterday and Today, released in the United States in the summer of 1966. I think it's the summer. Oh, actually, it was June 15th, 1966, so technically spring of 1966. Now, what this black triangle is, on certain covers, if you look carefully on the right side of the album, you might see an inverted black triangle, just kind of barely faintly visible. The reason it's there is because underneath that cover, you have the original cover of Yesterday and Today. The original cover consisted of a photograph taken by Robert Whittaker as part of a series of pictures called A Somnambulant Adventure. There are some weird pictures in that little collection. There's one of John Lennon having nails hammered into his head and a couple of other weird things, but the most memorable one, of course, ended up on the original cover of the Capitol Records album by the Beatles, Yesterday and Today. Most people listening probably know what it looks like, but it's a picture of the Beatles wearing turtlenecks and white butcher smocks, and they have bloody meat on their butcher smocks. They have baby doll parts, and obviously they don't think it's the most normal picture in the world. Ringo on the cover looks a little questioning. George has kind of a psychotic grin on his face as he holds the head of a baby doll. And this particular version of Yesterday and Today was known as the Butcher cover. It was pretty controversial, but let me get into a little bit of a backstory here. The reason Yesterday and Today exists in the first place is when British performing artists back in the 60s had their material released in the United States by American record labels, quite frequently the American albums did not match up with the British albums, and there's a good reason for that. Well, maybe not a good reason, but there's an explanation for that. The explanation is that the standard in the United Kingdom, and I believe most of Europe, was to put 14 songs on an album, 7 songs per side. In America, it was 12 or fewer, so 6 or fewer songs per side. The reason being, in the UK, when labels had to pay out royalties, it was done as a lump sum for the entire album. Didn't matter if there were 12 songs on the album, whether it was 14 songs on the album, the label would pay out the same amount in royalties. That's not the case in the United States, possibly all of North America. Here in the States, royalties have to be paid out on a per song basis. So an album with only 12 songs, the label is going to fork over less money than it would for an album of 14 songs. It wasn't just Capitol Records who did this. VJ Records, the other American label who licensed the Beatles before they hit it big, also chopped off a couple of songs on their album of Beatles songs. The Rolling Stones were victimized by this. The Animals were as well. And it wasn't just the Beatles. It was not just Capitol. It was just American labels, period. So Capitol Records, the first thing they put out was Meet the Beatles. That was, as far as they were concerned, the Beatles' first album. It was basically the American version of the Beatles' second British album called With the Beatles, but with some songs missing. Also, something that American labels wanted to do was put singles on the albums. The Beatles did not want to put singles on their albums. The exception, of course, Please Please Me, their first album, well, because they were a brand new group, and it had the 2 sides of their first 2 singles on it, because their singles were hits and ergo could be used as leverage to get people to buy the album. The other exceptions in England, A Hard Day's Night and Help, because, well, they were movie tie-ins, so they needed to put out singles to promote the movie. Revolver had a single, Eleanor Rigby and Yellow Submarine, but the reason they did that was because it became apparent to other performers in England that the Beatles were not going to release singles off their albums, so those performers released their own versions of Beatles songs that were not singles and had hits with them. And the Beatles said, hey, what's going on? Why can't we do that ourselves? So they tried it with Revolver, and of course it worked. They had a hit. But, of course, Capitol Records, number 1, was going to keep their albums down to 12 songs or fewer, and number 2, put the singles on them. So the lineup of Meet the Beatles contained I Want to Hold Your Hand and This Boy, both sides of the UK single, and I Saw Her Standing There, which was the B-side of the US single. So that's 3 songs right there, which meant that a maximum of 9 songs were going to be used from With the Beatles to make Meet the Beatles. And actually, I think Meet the Beatles was only 11 songs. So you have those leftover songs from With the Beatles. What do you do with them? You put them on another album that was manufactured by leftover songs and new songs. And the same process continued, kind of a chain reaction with Capitol Records. Songs that were left off previous Capitol Records albums that would have been on the Beatles equivalent Parlophone albums in the UK were compiled to make brand new albums. And when the Beatles heard about it, they were kind of ticked off. They're like, these are not the albums we recorded. The albums we did on Parlophone, that's what we recorded. Capitol is ruining them. And it wasn't unheard of for Capitol Records to call up EMI Records in London and say, hey, we need a couple of new Beatles songs for an upcoming album we're going to release. In one case, the Beatles went into the studio and just really quickly whipped up a couple of songs, a couple of Larry Williams covers, Dizzy Miss Lizzy and Bad Boy, and said, here you go. Basically, the Beatles weren't going to go through the effort of writing new songs just to satisfy Capitol's demands, so they just rushed out covers that they knew forwards and backwards. Same thing happened again in 1966. Capitol reaches out to the Beatles and says, hey, we need some songs to fill out this new album we're going to put out. So what happens? The Beatles were in the process of recording their Revolver album. they decided, let's send them Dr. Robert, I'm Only Sleeping, and And Your Bird Can Sing. Let's just whip up some quick mono mixes, ship them out over to Hollywood, and then we'll do our own mixes that we'll actually put some effort into. So those rough mixes were sent over to Capitol Records, who stuck them on the Yesterday and Today compilation. Something else Capitol Records needed for the cover was a photograph. So what happened? The Beatles and their management sent over the famous Butcher picture from the Robert Whittaker Somnambulant Adventure collection. The same picture had been used to promote the Beatles' Paperback Writer single in England and didn't really get a lot of controversy. I think there were some raised eyebrows, but that was it. In America, however, when Yesterday and Today was pressed and shipped to stores and other outlets, there were some people who said, wait a minute, we cannot sell this thing. We can't. This is disgusting. So the albums were recalled by Capitol Records. They reached out to the Beatles, said, we can't use that picture, send another one. So they took a picture in Brian Epstein's office, their manager's office. It was just a bland picture, just the four of them with Paul McCartney sitting inside a trunk. And they said, here you go. Capitol Records airbrushed it white, and that became the new album cover. So the plan was to destroy the old covers, make new covers. I don't remember if that plan was actually put into place, but at some point, either really early on in the process or the process didn't happen at all, somebody said, wait a minute, this is going to cost us a lot of money to destroy and then remake the album covers. Why don't we just paste this new cover over the existing ones? That'll save us some money. So that's what happened. The new cover was pasted over the old ones. That delayed the release of the album a little bit. So that still cost Capitol Records some money. And there were people who bought the record and kind of noticed there was something peeking through the airbrushed white cover. And there are people who basically unpeeled the cover and discovered there was another cover underneath it. Some people were successful in peeling, some people were not. Some people actually were able to get the original cover fully intact, not even with the new one pasted over, because there was a store or two that refused to send back the albums after the recall. I believe the number was somewhere in the 700,000s in terms of how many of these Butcher covers got out into the public, whether they be totally exposed or pasted over. Naturally, copies of Yesterday and Today with the original Butcher cover easily sell for a lot of money, anywhere from several hundred to in the 10,000s, depending on various circumstances like condition, whether it's mono versus stereo, etc. Common belief is that paste-over versions with the new cover intact are actually worth more money than the ones that don't have the new cover over it because, well, a lot of people had the bland cover peeled off so that they now had a copy of Yesterday and Today that only had the original cover. Generally, the advice that people give about whether or not to peel your Butcher cover, if you're lucky enough to have one, is if the record in its current state looks good, there are no problems with it, don't have it peeled. But if the new blander cover that was pasted over is in not so good shape, then yeah, have a professional peel it so now you have a much better condition cover. But whatever the case, the giveaway that the copy of Yesterday and Today that you're looking at is one of those paste-over versions is that on the right side, in the white, you will see a black triangular-looking glob from Ringo's black pullover on the original cover, kind of bleeding through. Once you're able to identify that, you will be able to spot a pasted-over Butcher cover a mile away. So while we were at Beatlefest in 1999, when we went to various dealer tables, and they had these Yesterday and Today albums, of course, not out in the open, but kind of behind their chairs, out of access to everybody, but on display, we would look and see if we could spot the black triangle. And guess what? We could. We learned to do that instantly. Number of Butcher covers we actually walked away with? 0. Come on, we didn't have that kind of money. No way. Especially because we were about to get married and needed to save money. By the way, 26 years later, number of Butcher covers we have? 0. We do have a Yesterday and Today, but it is not a Butcher cover, and I knew that upon purchase. But what are you going to do? Now, back to our wedding. My soon-to-be mother-in-law at the time, well, currently mother-in-law, period, bumped into an old friend of Lisa's at the store one day, and he said, hey, how's Lisa doing? And she said, oh, she's doing good. She's going to be getting married soon. And Jason said to her, "You tell her that as a wedding present to her, I will play piano for her wedding, no charge." So of course we were going to take up the offer. The plan was, as people filed in and were being ushered to their seats, he would play All You Need Is Love on the piano. As Lisa walked down the aisle, he'd play In My Life, the Beatles song. All You Need Is Love was actually my mother-in-law's idea. In My Life was Lisa's idea. So obviously we're both big Beatles fans. The thing is, Jason wasn't really familiar with the Beatles, even though he was a professional musician. He led a gospel choir in Newark. He lived in his parents' basement and basically converted it into a home recording studio with 2 pianos, a multi-track reel-to-reel recorder, and microphones and everything. But he still wasn't familiar with the songs. But his mom was a first-generation screaming preteen Beatles fan. So he asked her to get her Beatles albums out so he could listen to the songs and get himself familiar with them. This was within a couple of weeks after we got back home from Beatlefest. So Mrs. Webb got out her box of Beatles records, and unlike most preteen first-generation Beatles fans, she took really good care of those records. They were in beautiful condition. So we're flipping through, we're looking for Rubber Soul, and we're looking for either Magical Mystery Tour or Yellow Submarine, both of which have All You Need Is Love. And we happened to see Yesterday and Today. So Lisa and I just laughed. We said, "Hey, let's see if we can spot the black triangle." My friends, I kid you not. In the shrink wrap was still on. The record was open, but the shrink wrap was still on. There it was, the black triangle, peeking through that white space on the right. Lisa and I screamed our heads off. "Mrs. Webb, get down here!" She came running down. She said, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" And we showed her the record. She had no idea what she had. Mrs. Webb did not know anything about this fabled butcher cover, but there it was, peeking through the paste over. I pulled the record out of the sleeve. It was practically a mirror. It was so spotless, so well cared for. I could see every little pore in my face. It was so clear. The surface was so beautiful. Lisa handed her the album and said, "Hide this somewhere. Your husband will never find it. If he ever finds out what this is, he will try to sell it." Mrs. Webb agreed. He would definitely try to sell it. As for her son, Jason has since become a Broadway conductor. Do a Google search for Jason Michael Webb. He played at our wedding. And because of him and his friendship with Lisa, I was able to hold in my hand a Yesterday and Today butcher cover that was in shockingly, absolutely perfect condition. I've heard similar stories over the years since, and just recently as weeks ago, I still see messages on various forums saying, "I went to an estate sale and I managed to grab a butcher cover for only $10. Alas, I've never had such luck. Well, I've never gone to an estate sale, but most Yesterday and Todays I see out in the wild aren't even original pressings, but either repressings or later reissues on the Apple label or on one of Capitol's various non-black rainbow swirl labels, like, say, that weird op art Capitol label with the olive green background and that blinding purple pinkish Capitol logo. Any of you listening who aren't really diehard record collectors and you might find yourself with a stack of records you're just thinking of donating, maybe it's worth your while to do a little bit of investigating and make sure that what you have is something you definitely just want to get rid of, as opposed to, say, maybe saving it or making a buck off of it. Because you never know. In your collection, there might be a black triangle of your own that you don't know about. It is now time for me to rate Educate Your Dog by the Eisenmann Method, and this will come as no surprise to people who've heard this podcast before, but I do apply my own ratings to each item that I review. My ratings are based on 5 factors. Number 1, local interest or usefulness, usually not both. Sometimes both, but usually not. Historical interest as well. Is this record a representative sign of its time? Uniqueness, give that a rating as well. And of course, weirdness, because after all, this podcast is called My Weird Record Collection. And of course, what good is having a record if you don't enjoy it? So enjoyability is also factored in my ratings, and each of those factors gets a rating of anywhere between 1 and 5 inclusive, meaning that each record will have a composite score of somewhere between 5 and 25 inclusive. So let's start with local interest or usefulness. Now, there's no real localness identifiable with Chuck Eisenmann. I mean, the guy's been all over the place, and I don't think there's one specific place he's really associated with. So I'm just going to focus on the usefulness. After all, this is meant to be an instructional album. Here's the thing. The record is called Educate Your Dog. And as I look at the cover, I notice that he has 5 German Shepherds on the front cover. On the back cover, there are 2. His history, as far as I can tell, only involves German Shepherds. He brags about 30 years of experience, but with only one breed, and he does seem to indicate that his techniques will work with any breed.
Once you've become familiar with the 10 mandatory rules and the 5 basic sounds so necessary to educate your dog, no matter what their breed, you must remember that in order to educate, you must first be educated.
That might be true, but the thing is, he's kind of assuming that all dogs and all breeds are alike in terms of how they can be, well, as he says, educated. And I don't think he necessarily knew what he was talking about in that regards. German Shepherds, sure, I would trust his word easily, especially because German Shepherds have a reputation of being easily trainable. My dog, however, a beagle, beagles are very difficult to train. So that's all I'm going to say about that. But also, I would think that if you really want to train your dog or educate your dog, you'd really want to learn from a book that'll give you more details, or maybe even from some kind of obedience class. So I don't know. I'm just going to be a little bit wishy-washy and rate the usefulness of this record 3 out of 5. Now, historical interest, well, there's not much really historically representative unless you're really into Hollywood acting dogs. If anything, maybe this record is a sign of how dogs were raised 50 years ago as opposed to now in 2025. Because nowadays, the big mantra that is repeated is adopt, don't shop. But when Chuck recorded the record, it was obvious that buying a dog was the default method of canine acquisition. Also, corporal punishment. Let me tell you, nowadays, you do not ever want to be accused of corporally punishing. Is corporally a word? I don't know. It's not my script, but you don't want to be accused of corporally punishing a dog unless you want to get hanged. Now, on the record, it doesn't sound like Chuck explicitly vilifies, say, corporal punishment and other physical discipline. He clearly mentions that he prefers mental discipline over physical discipline, but he doesn't go so far as to shame people who physically discipline a dog. I don't know. It's hard to say how I could rate this record historically. So once again, I'm going to be very indecisive and rate it 3 out of 5 in historical interest. How about uniqueness? Dog training records are not unusual. There are a whole bunch of them out there. As for educating your dog by the Eisenmann method, well, on Discogs.com at the time that I'm recording this, there's only one copy for sale. And on eBay, there is a copy for $19.95. I didn't see any copies listed on Etsy or Amazon. Those are really the 4 main places that I check. These are by far not the only possible places to get weird records, but just off the top of my head. As for me, basically the record's findable, but it's not the most findable. So I don't know. I really feel bad about doing this, but I'm going to be kind of middling again with the uniqueness rating and give it 3 out of 5. Now, weirdness, that's another story. I was excited to find this record, but when I listened, it wasn't nearly as weird as I would have expected, really. So my first instinct was to give the record a rating of 1 for weirdness. Then I thought, it does seem kind of odd that the guy who wrote 4 dog training books would do a record that doesn't even clock in at an hour. It seems to me a book would be much more effective, wouldn't it? So, yeah, I'll give the rating a 2 for weirdness. Enjoyability. Here's the thing. This record was not meant to be enjoyable, nor was it presented as enjoyable. This is instructional. Once again, I was going to rate enjoyability just a 1, but there are a couple of moments on the record where you hear him talk to one of his dogs.
Hobo, do you mind not getting too close to the microphone? Excuse me, I've got my dogs here in the studio.
And I thought that was a nice little touch there, that just spontaneously he had to address the dogs. So just that alone gave this record some enjoyability merit. So instead of 1, I'll give it a 2. So going back over the ratings, that's 3 for usefulness, 3 for historical interest, 3 for uniqueness, 2 for weirdness, 2 for enjoyability. Add all those up together, you get 13, which ties the record with tuning your auto harp and background music for your home movies. I will break the tie by putting this above tuning your auto harp because, well, even though this isn't, I don't know, I wouldn't find this to be the most useful method of training your dog, but I'll tell you what, using a record to train your dog is at least slightly more useful than using a record to help you tune your auto harp. My friends, that was everything that I could tell you about Educate Your Dog by the Eisenmann Method. How about you, my friends? Do you have any thoughts on this record or anything else relevant to this podcast? Well, before I tell you what next month's episode might be featuring, I'm going to tell you where you can send your thoughts. And of course, I'm going to give credit where credit is due. My email address is myweirdrecords@fab4it.com. Fab4IT is spelled F-A-B, the number 4, I-T. The website for this podcast, which also includes the show notes for each episode and some other goodies here and there, the address is just like my email address, but instead of an @ sign, you stick a dot in there. So it's myweirdrecords.fab4it.com in your favorite web browser. By the way, while you are on my website, you'll notice there is a link that says Buy Me a Coffee. By clicking on Buy Me a Coffee, you will be taken to a site in which you can donate a few dollars to this podcast. And the theoretical thing is that you're treating the recipient to a cup of coffee or something, but I don't like coffee. I'm not going to use it for coffee. I'll use it for tea or maybe maintenance that involves this podcast. Also on that website, given that it is September when this episode is released, and September is National Suicide Prevention Month, I figured I should do something on this podcast that has some kind of connection to that. And what I decided was I'm adding a section to the website dedicated to links to various mental health resources because I am a big advocate for mental health. Mental health is as important as physical health in maintaining your general well-being. Here in the United States, you can dial 988 for mental health crises. I'll try to include as many worldwide resources as I possibly can. You can also reach out to me on the various social networks where my handle is My Weird Records. Finally getting to use Threads, by the way. I've been having a lot of fun with Threads, getting caught up in a lot of Chicago discussion. Not that that's a bad thing. I love Chicago. You can also look for this podcast on Facebook. That's another social network that I'm on. Look for My Weird Record Collection, or you can go directly to facebook.com/myweirdrecords. And guess what? You can also listen to this podcast on YouTube, and you will find not only episodes of this podcast, but also audio dumps of the records that I discuss and some occasional bonus videos that will be about both my weird and not so weird record collections. And you can go to YouTube and do a search for My Weird Record Collection, or go straight to youtube.com/@MyWeirdRecordCollection. I hereby offer many, many thanks to some people, including my buddy Tim Christ, aka Shoebox, aka Worm Quartet, for letting me use his record, The Pac-Man EP, as the basis for the logo for this podcast. Tim and his You'll Be Sorry If You Don't Listen to It music can be found on his website at worm-quartet.com. .web.app. Also, big thank you to my buddy Kevin Zerby for designing the logo artwork for this podcast using Tim's The Pac-Man EP. Kevin and his music and his podcasts, including his latest, titled Mono, they're all available on the web at zerbinator.com. And a big thank you goes out to the wonderful staff over at Rediscover Records. You know what you did. Thank you so much. Now, next month, October 2025, that's my birth month. So I figured what I will do is look into a record that my wife got me for my birthday last year. Without giving away exactly what it is, maybe I should start giving away ahead of time. What do you think? But without giving it 100% away, the topic is given by somebody who might not necessarily be the most experienced to claim expertise in that topic, let's just say. But until you get to hear exactly what it is, I thank you again for listening, my friends. This is Sean, reminding you to support your local record store. And if you don't have a local record store, take a day trip to somewhere that has a local record store and support that one. I'll be back next month with another episode of this podcast that you can listen to and listen to again and again and again and again and again and again.
A human is gullible, and you can often fool him.